No, I'm Not a Human has just received an update which has introduced a whole host of new characters and even minor developments in the story. So join me today as we uncover the narrative of that of No, I'm Not a Human. Now, before we begin, I would encourage you to subscribe to my channel where I analyze the storytelling techniques of many forms of media, such as games, movies, books, and etc. And without further ado, let us begin. The story commences with the protagonist's neighbor stopping by and informing the protagonist of the rumors of an impending apocalypse. These being that the sun will vaporize anyone that steps outside during the daytime, and that these creatures called visitors will roam the land. Visitors are extremely hostile if left to their own accord, and are very good at blending in with the many humans that end up knocking on the protagonist's door. Following the neighbor divulging the rumors, he suggests allowing people to reside in the protagonist's house. The importance of this being revealed when the pale visitor comes around and asks about who dwells inside. As if a protagonist is alone, then he will barge in and kill them, abruptly ending the game. The neighbor's initial address is not only informative, but also is crucial story-wise, as it cements the psychological horror aspect, with protagonists never truly knowing who to trust, despite the fact that they are obliged to allow guests into their house. Touching on the topic of guests, I will not be going over every single guest and their interactions, as due to the sheer quantity, it would be difficult to cover them all, especially since in regards to the story, they are limited in terms of interaction, and after a few playthroughs, you will exhaust all the dialogue, and although most characters have a story to tell, they are not all particularly interesting, and for the most part, just fluff up the story for the perceived depth to be slightly greater. Upon the protagonist's neighbor leaving, he drops some beers off, a kind gesture that will never be repaid due to his death that follows in a few nights. As the story progresses, the protagonist encounters many characters such as the barman and cashier girl, and he must perform a series of tests to determine whether or not the person in question is a visitor or a human. However, these tests are not always reliable and may be skewed through backstory. For example, a sign of a visitor is dirty fingernails, but a gravedigger is sure to have dirty fingernails due to his line of work, meaning that the results aren't always consistent. Thus, this builds up the ambiguity and stress which ramps up as the story progresses. This progression is aligned with the amount of symptoms the protagonist must check for, with the protagonist being informed of a new symptom by the news with each passing day. This cycle of a protagonist allowing guests into their house and testing them continues for several days, this occurring all while FEMA, an agency responsible for containing the visitors and ensuring the safety of the people, expand their facilities and reign over the land to cover up the fact that they are corrupt, with them using any sign of a symptom to slaughter as many people as they can, and from time to time they'll stop by the protagonist's house and evict a few guests, adding to the prior mentioned tension, because as the protagonist's guests dwindle down either due to FEMA being killed by the protagonist or being killed by the visitors, it then creates a need for the protagonist to invite more guests into his house to keep a pale visitor at bay. This vicious cycle continues into one of the many endings are achieved, each being linked to the protagonist's ability to attain a sense of peace, or rather a lack of, this being dependent on which ending is achieved. For the purpose of this video, I will discuss only the most relevant endings, the first being the standard survival and death ending, where the protagonist makes it to the final day. On day 14, the protagonist and his guest must bunker up in the basement. If there are no visitors in the protagonist's humble abode, then he will survive. However, if there are, then he will meet a grueling death. For due to the internal conflict the protagonist faces, both survival and death result in the protagonist feeling rather dreary. Now obviously, the protagonist being ripped to pieces is a demise which is not all that flattering, but as for his survival, one may question why he seems so down in the dumps after him having lived. For you must understand, one key aspect about the protagonist and the game as a whole is the ambiguity. The game preys on the player having limited knowledge, with the audience barely knowing who the protagonist is. And although it is briefly alluded to, he seems to have a rather troubling family life, resulting in him living alone with no aim nor direction. Thus, due to lacking a purpose, the traditional survival ending is portrayed in a negative light, which brings forth the multifaceted nature of a protagonist and in turn makes him seem fleshed out as his backstory is conveyed as more than what we know and expands beyond the events of the game. This once more is reiterated in the embrace of the inevitable ending, where he enters a hole through the basement and seemingly dies. However, upon dying, he finds peace on a small grass plain with a house and a fence being the only contents. It is implied that he is able to relinquish all his earthly burdens and achieve peace, and one can assume that this is the best ending due to his condition of death, with pulling to avoid being much more graceful than being ripped apart. Moreover, death is a common theme in the game and crucial in regards to the story, with death being personified as an odd creature, one which is equally as esoteric in appearance and purpose. And to a certain extent, both death and the protagonist share similar qualities, such as their merciless approach, with the protagonist functioning as an individual who ultimately decides the life of others. The final ending which I want to touch on is the FEMA ending, where the protagonist joins FEMA, an expendable pawn evident by the reflection in the hazmat mask, symbolizing the lack of individuality as the protagonist becomes part of a machine which wreaks havoc on the world. The flow of the story, along with the listed endings, all portray a dystopian and rather nihilistic world, which due to its first-person perspective is rather immersive and makes for good storytelling, even if at times the story is rather shallow. The game has many more endings, however, they are either comedic or esoteric beyond belief, and they don't contribute too much to the wider value of a story in a meaningful manner. However, I do recommend that you play the game yourself, and so that you can get to experience the full extent of a story, as an explanation, analysis, or review of a story can never replace the first-hand experience. As we proceed to the second half of the video, we will be analysing both the pros and cons of a plot and the way in which it is conveyed, to which I will score the story out of 10. No, I'm Not a Human ultimately succeeds as a story-orientated game due to the atmosphere. Even the setting itself, being a lonely house that sits just past the city, helps clue the audience into the separation between that of the protagonist and greater society, not to mention the night vision filter and the merger of 2D and 3D effects. These not being only visually appealing, but also correspond to that of the contents of a story. And just to put it out there, the soundtrack in No I'm Not a Human is absolutely phenomenal and furthers the atmospheric storytelling, and thus the majority of the story is not conveyed in words, but instead the setting and subtle effects, which really sets apart this piece from other storytelling games. No I'm Not a Human also flourishes in regard to quantity, as there are a vast array of endings and characters, and though some interactions may be shallow, at least they are there, with each character having some sort of unique gimmick and interaction. Ambiguity is also not only a core theme, but is effectively used to construct a gripping story, this being accentuated by the symptoms being able to be misconstrued and the luck factor involved in picking apart who is a guest and who is a visitor. Also, as mentioned previously, the protagonist's backstory is only alluded to and never outright stated, which allows the audience to create theories and infer what life was like prior to the apocalypse. Moreover, what we do know is that the protagonist is rather depressed, this playing into the somber tone and is not done in a cliche or boring manner, as instead of it being forced, it's enacted in a way that the protagonist is consumed by the commotion of a visitor's and blazing sun, that they now have the ability to disregard more depressive times, that being the events prior to the apocalypse. These elements individually are nothing special, though the ambiguity in tandem with the perverse portrayal of the characters both suit the art style and allow the soundtrack to shine. So all in all, it was successful in laying out a comprehensive, short, yet engaging story. However, no story is without its weaknesses. No I'm Not a Human suffers from falsified depth. There's barely enough content to cover the endings, not to mention that the appeals of a game, that being the guest, should progress the game, for it seems as though the progression of a story is solely tied to the protagonist's actions, which can be viewed as a flaw in regards to storytelling. Another complaint is that after time, characters begin to feel faceless, in the sense that after you exhaust the guest dialogue options, there's nothing really more to explore, and due to their limited dialogue, there's a lack of much needed depth in the story, which ultimately detracts from the supposed fear factor of visitors. The ambiguity, although serving the story, in some instances also works as a double-edged sword, with a lack of backstory and any real progression being masked as ambiguity, this resulting in some instances of the story being shallow, the shallowness being a big issue in terms of replayability, as besides the various endings, the actual flow of the story itself is rather monotonous, with it being a loop of night and day, and once you already have a gauge of what the signs of visitors are, then it takes the amusement out of decision making. This may sound rather harsh, though don't allow me to deter you from playing the game. I do believe it is one of the better story orientated games that have been released this year, and it really hones into the aesthetic in a way I have seen no other game do. So with that, I'll score the story of the game a 7 to 8 out of 10. It's good yet has room for improvement. Now, before I conclude the video, I would like to say that I've released a book called Cutthroat Carnival, in which I urge you to check out. It's free on Kindle and should be readily accessible, with it being a passion project of mine due to my love for storytelling. Anyway, that's enough from me. I thank you for watching and wish you a good night.